Hola a todos, bienvenidos.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Por cualquier cosa, para poder escuchar los subtítulos cuando
If
estemos
you
en
would
inglés o
like
cuando los
to
presentadores
hear
hagan
interpretation
uso del
when
idioma inglés,
people are
abajo en
speaking
su pantalla, al
English,
lado de grabar,
you will
hay un botoncito
find
y dice
an
mostrar
option
subtítulos y otro que
called
es interpretación.
Show
Si le
Captions
dan en
and another one
interpretación,
called Interpretation.
automáticamente les
If
va a
you click on
aparecer en su idioma,
Interpretation,
en el idioma que
then
prefieran.
you will
Si lo
be able
dejan
to
en
select
inglés,
your preferred
no
language.
tienen necesidad de
If
apretarle nada
you
más y
prefer English,
seguimos
then
con
you
clase.
don't need to
Bueno,
select anything
gracias por
else.
esperarnos
Okay,
a
well,
todos.
thank
Gracias
you
por
so
estar
much for your
aquí
patience.
después
Thank you
de
for being here
mucho tiempo y
after
de
a
estar
long
todos
time,
unidos con mucho
after a
entusiasmo.
long
Soy muy
and
contenta de
enthusiastic
tener al
wait
panel que
for
tenemos,
this
a los invitados de
book.
hoy.
I'm so
Y
happy to
antes de
have this
empezar,
panel
quiero agradecer
and our
a
guests here.
nuestros tech
Before
support,
starting,
Ross
I
y
would like
Santiago Grani,
to
a
thank our
Laura, que
tech
va a ser
support,
nuestra intérprete.
Ross,
Y
Santiago,
bueno, les
and Laura,
presento
our
al
interpreter.
panel y un poco
Let
de
me
qué
introduce
vamos
the panel
hoy.
and let me introduce the book that brings us
América
here
Soy
together.
presenta
The
su libro
America
Economía en
Soy
crisis.
introduces its new book,
Es
Economy in Crisis.
un libro necesario y
It's a very
urgente para la
necessary and
región
urgent book
que nos va a
for the
ayudar a
region,
entender
which will
qué ha
enable us
pasado con el
to
desarrollo de la economía
understand
en América
what has
Latina
happened
y los límites de la
with
teoría
the
orthodox en
teaching
economía.
of economy
Considera las
and
particularidades
its
de la región,
limits in the region. It
los
considers
aspectos
the
políticos, sociales y
peculiarities of
económicos
the region,
y también hace
its more
estudios de caso por
salient
cada país.
economic and political characteristics
De
and
ahí,
conflicts
la
in each country and
principal
their history.
aportación que
The
hace este
main
libro, podría decirse,
input provided by this book
es que muchos de los problemas que hemos
is the
tenido
fact that
en
many of the problems that
políticas
we have
y
had in public
implementación
policy
de atención
and the
a
design
emergencias como la
of
crisis del COVID,
emergency
de ahí
response
la
like the
actualidad,
COVID
o sea,
crisis
las últimas 3 décadas,
up to, well,
derivan
the
principalmente
last
de lo que
3
se está
decades,
enseñando en las aulas
are
y de los
derived from
límites
what's
de la
being
economía
taught
clásica para responder
and the
a los
limits of
retos de América Latina.
neoclassical economics
Hoy tenemos a
for the
los
challenges in Latin
editores,
America.
Ignacio
We
Silva
have
Nader
the
y Andrés
publishers, Ignacio
Lambertini.
Silva
Ignacio Silva fue
and
editor y
Andres
es director
Lambertini.
ejecutivo de
Ignacio
Opus, el
Silva
Observatorio de Políticas
is the
Económicas en
book
Chile.
editor and executive
Andrés
director of
Lambertini
Opus.
también fue el
Andres
editor
Lambertini
y es
is also
miembro
the
del
editor
GEPEC,
and is
el grupo
a member
local
of Bajando
de
Economia,
Rethinking Economics en Argentina.
the local rethinking
Carolina
economics
Alves
group
es
for
profesora asociada
Argentina.
en el
Carolina
Instituto para la
Alves is an
Innovación
associate professor
y
at the Institute for Innovation
el Public Purpose,
and Public Purpose
en UCL. Las traducciones ahí
at
son raras,
UCL.
como queda raro en español.
Translation is
También nos
strange here.
acompaña Gabriel Porcil,
We also have
oficial
Gabriel
de Asuntos
Persili,
Económicos de la División de Desarrollo
Economic
Productivo y
Affairs
Empresarial
Officer
en la Unidad
at
de
the
Desarrollo
Productive
Industrial y
and
Tecnológico
Business
de la CEPAL.
Development Unit
Nos van a
at CEPAL.
ser muy amables en comentarnos el libro y en
They
platicarnos
will
un poco de la
be
experiencia que hubo en traducirlo.
gently going to
Les recuerdo que ya
comment
pueden
on the
descargar el
book.
libro en la página de América
Let me
Soy
remind you that you
totalmente
can
gratis.
already
Y
download
bueno,
this book free of charge.
empezamos, si quieren,
So let's begin
Carolina. Y de ahí,
with Carolina.
cualquier pregunta lo pueden dejar en el chat
If you have any
después de la
question, you
presentación.
can
Tenemos
leave them all
preguntas
on the chat. We will be having a Q&A
levantando la
session
mano,
towards the
sin
end.
encender sus micrófonos.
You can also raise your
Entonces,
hand, or you can just
ok.
write them down.
Bueno, empezamos con Andrés.
Okay, so let's begin with Andres.
Pantalla.
You can share your screen now.
No, igual no tengo
Well,
mucho para compartir.
I don't have a lot to share
Tampoco voy a hablar
on
mucho,
screen,
simplemente
and I won't be speaking a
queríamos
whole
hablar
lot.
con
We
Ignacio
just
unos
wanted
minutos
to talk with
comienzo, antes
Ignacio
de escuchar
for a
a
few
Carolina
minutes
y
before
a
listening to
Gabriel.
Carolina and to Gabriel.
La gracia de este evento de lanzamiento para
The
poner
purpose
un poco
of this launch
contexto
event is to provide a little bit of
explicando un poco
context
qué es lo que
and
estamos
to
haciendo
explain a little bit about what
y
we're
qué se
presenting
trata.
today and what this book is
Pero
about.
bueno, igual primero quiero agradecerles
First of
a
all, I'd
todos
like
y a todas
to
por
thank
haber asistido
everyone
al evento de hoy.
for attending today's
Realmente estamos
event.
muy contentos de poder
We
finalmente estar presentando
are
este libro
really glad to be
que
finally
llevó
presenting this book.
mucho tiempo, mucho
It
esfuerzo.
took a lot of time and
Un
effort.
libro que comenzó en el medio del
It's a book
caos
that started
de
off in the
2020
midst of
con la
chaos
pandemia
in 2020
porque
during the pandemic,
en realidad viene a suplantar un proyecto muy
because
distinto, que
it
era una
preceded a
conferencia
very different
presidencial
project, which
de la
was
América
a
Soy
conference
presencial
from the
en
America
uno de los
Soy,
países de
and it
nuestro
was going to take
de
place
nuestro
on site
región,
in one of our
donde
member
empiezan
states,
a asistir los miembros de las
where
distintas
the
organizaciones,
members
los
of the
distintos
different
grupos,
organizations, the
a
different groups might be
conocerse,
able to
debatir,
attend and meet
pero bueno, por
and
razones
debate and
obvias
discuss.
esto fue
But due to
imposible
obvious reasons, that
y nos
became
encontramos
impossible.
con
And
el
thus,
proyecto hacia el cual mutó, que era
we
Economía en crisis.
moved into this project
Em,
called
Este
Economics in
libro se
Crisis.
enmarca dentro de la agenda más general de Rethinking Economics, que para quienes no lo sepan
This
es una
book is part of the
retrospectiva
more global
anual
agenda of
de
Rethinking
centros
Economics, which is a global
profesionales de las
network
ciencias
of
económicas que tienen como
students,
objetivo
teachers,
transformar
and
la forma en
educators
cual
and
se
professionals
enseña
in
y cómo
economics
se entiende
who
en general
are aiming to
la
transform the
economía.
way economics are
Dentro
taught
de
and
esa red
understood.
global de América Soy,
Within
que
this
es
global
la
network, the
organización
America
desde la
Soy,
cual nos encargamos
the
de llevar
organization
este
at
proyecto,
which we
es una red
undertook this project,
regional
is a
similar en
regional network,
características, ¿no? También
which is
agrupa
similar in
distintas
characteristics.
organizaciones y distintos
It
grupos
groups several groups
con,
and
que son estudiantes, docentes,
organizations,
profesionales, con el mismo
professionals,
objetivo, pero con
students,
particularidad,
educators,
radicados en
going
América
after
Latina
the same goal,
y con la
but who are based in
particularidad
Latin America
de aplicar el lente
and
a estas
who
temáticas
are
en diferentes
applying
realidades
this lens
cada país del mundo.
into their unique problems
Siguiendo con
in
este
the
objetivo
region.
fundacional, ¿no?
Following this
de
foundational
la
goal
enseñanza de la
of
economía, de transformar
transforming
la manera de entenderla
the way
y con el
economics is
objetivo
taught and
pedagógico
understood, and with the
que en el prólogo
program
también
goal,
categorizamos como político,
which is
de
also deemed
fortalecer la red
political
y
at the
fortalecer las
prologue,
organizaciones
of
que la consiguen,
strengthening the network
por
and
eso
strengthening the
es que se concibe el
organizations making it
proyecto,
up.
este libro, ¿no?
That is how this book was
Em,
conceived.
Nada, creo que no tengo mucho más para decir. Simplemente
There's
como
not a lot
generar un
more
poco
to
de
add.
contexto para
I
entender
just
el
wanted
tema,
to
para
give,
entender de
to
dónde
provide some
viene, de
context
quiénes somos,
for us to understand who we are and what we're
que
doing,
trabajamos y que coordinamos
the
este
people
proyecto.
who coordinated this project and who worked on
Reitero,
it.
porque es así,
I
que
would like
estamos muy
to
felices, estamos muy
reiterate
contentos de
that
poder
we
estar
are very
presentando
happy
este libro
to
que
be
se
launching
hizo en
this
medio del
book,
caos, costó mucho
which
terminar,
was
costó
conceived
mucho
in the midst
tiempo,
of chaos.
mucho
It took
esfuerzo,
a
mucho
lot
trabajo.
of time, a lot of effort, a lot
Y
of work,
estamos muy felices
but
de
we
que haya
are
salido.
very
Estamos
happy
muy
that it
agradecidos
came
a todas
out.
las
We're very
personas
grateful
que
to
formaron
all
parte
the
de este
people who were
proyecto,
part of this
que ayudaron
project
para que
and
saliera.
who contributed for it
Todos los
to
profesores y
come out,
profesoras
to
pares
all
de
those
cada
who reviewed, to all the
capítulo,
peers
revisores y revisores
who
particulares
looked at each
que
chapter. Each
aportaron
chapter had
comentarios
their own
y
peer
correcciones,
reviewers.
tanto en
They
términos
provided
formativos como
comments and
contenidos.
corrections, both in form
Y
and
bueno, a
content.
Karen, quien ayudó mucho en este trayecto final
Karen,
de
who helped us
difusión
a
y
lot,
presentación del libro,
and
a
the
Ross,
dissemination and
que
communication.
estaba al
Ross
comienzo
Cathcart,
ayudándonos con
who
algunos
was helping
technical
us with
aspects,
technical problems in English.
organizador de Rethinking Economics,
He's an
Jimena
organizational
Pupo,
member of Rethinking
el autor del
Economics.
libro, que también
Jimena
trabajó
Pupo,
sobre el
book
tránsito
designer,
para
who
trabajar
was
en
also
este libro
very
y acompañarnos.
helpful
Y
in
bueno,
designing this book.
fundamentalmente,
And
estamos
fundamentally,
más que agradecidos
we
del
are
enorme
more
trabajo
than
realizado por
grateful
todos los
for
autores y
the
sus
great
colaboraciones.
work provided by each of
Economía
the
en crisis es
authors.
un libro que
Economy in
tiene trabajos
Crisis
de gran
is
calidad,
a book
realmente.
containing high quality
Creemos
works,
que va a ser
and we
un
believe
primer paso
that it will be a first step
en la discusión y un primer paso
towards a
en realidad en la generación de propuestas
discussion
para transformar la enseñanza de
and
la economía
to
a partir
design
de economías
proposals
en las mallas
for
curriculares en la
teaching
escuela,
economics
pero
and
también
to
creemos
change
que va a ser
curricula
un gran aporte
at
para la
schools.
discusión
But it will
sobre
also
la
become a great
enseñanza de
input
economía
for a
y sobre el
discussion
rol
about
que tiene
teaching
la
economics
formulación
and
y la
its
implementación
bond
de las políticas económicas.
with the
Y bueno,
implementation of
para
economic
saber más sobre el
politics
contenido del libro,
and
sobre la
policy.
lectura, los dejo con Ignacio.
But let me leave you with Ignacio to get to know more a little bit about the structure of the book.
Hola a todos y a todas.
Hello,
Primeramente,
everyone. First of all, I want to thank you all as well. I want to thank everyone who is attending this event and to all those who provided comments. I want to provide more context about how we can frame today's event, about what we are going to be talking about, what we will be discussing, and to invite you all to read the parts of the book that you're interested in most. I would like to thank all the authors of all the chapters. You were able to reflect the realities of economics in each of the countries. Gabrielle and Carolina, who also agreed to participate in a more extended manner and to deal with the topic of the book. There are two great topics, two great themes that we want to discuss with this book: economic policy in Latin American countries and teaching economics in Latin America, and how these two are interrelated, how we have viewed these two elements, which are bound together, and some questions arise. Is teaching economics what determines policy, or is economic policy what determines the way economics is taught? The answer is not clear, and it's not one way. It's a bidirectional relation, but it's cross-cutting. In Latin America, we can find what it's meant in each of the countries with the implementation of military dictatorships, both in terms of the drastic economic policy and the beginning of neoliberalism in the region with different nuances. And the region in itself is affected by this cross-cutting fact, and which also affects social life, this drastic move into neoliberalism. As a first step, there is a dialogue in the chapters of this book. Each chapter addresses the reality of one country, written by the members of the groups of the America Soy. There is a chapter about Argentina, one about Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Colombia, and Mexico. Based on this discussion, building on the discussion on the neoliberal model in recent history and the dictatorships in these countries, there is a new development of curricula in schools and what this has meant for each of the countries of the region. This has left an open-ended question. Within recent history, what are the opportunities in these countries to change the reality of teaching, to make it fit the current reality? Within these chapters, we were able to invite a few economists to collaborate with us. That's why the book has an introduction by Matias Armango and Esteban Perez, providing context about resistance and sustainability or unsustainability of neoliberalism in the region. And the final chapter is by Karina Forsenebro, who is questioning the sustainability of the reproduction of life in the region. So just to conclude and to give the floor to Carolina and Gabriel, with this book and as an organization, the America Soy, we would like to pose questions for discussion. We see neoliberal models reproducing themselves in schools and in society. So the fight to change this is not only an educational fight, but also a fight to change society. So we question what we do every day as economists in order to see new solutions. Thus, it is important to create knowledge that fights against realities boosted by Western capitalism, represented by the white man. And thus, we need creative solutions that are meant for the Global South and are designed by the Global South. So I give the floor to Karen without further ado. Thank you. Now let's begin with Carolina, who will be given her presentation in English. If you'd like to activate simultaneous interpretation, you will find the interpretation option besides captions. You will be able to select your preferred language, and thus you will be able to listen to the presentation in its entirety.
And thank you for hosting this event. And also thank you, of course, Ignacio and Andres for editing this book in such a pertinent subject, and also for trying to trying to bring that discussion, like the heterodoxy in Latin America together, as you mentioned before. And of course, thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm really pleased to be here. Okay, so I will share I have like just a few slides. It's not many, but yeah, let me just wait before sharing. Just make it a full screen slideshow. Yeah. Nope. Just 1 second. And then, okay, so I'm trying to share now. I think this is where I should be. Screen 1, hopefully. So is everything okay? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, so yes, I have been invited here today to talk about the book, obviously, but also to trying to approach that discussion from that perspective of the struggles that heterodoxy faces in academia. I took that in Ignacio's suggestion very literally, because I thought it was a challenge as well to discuss that, because you can approach that struggles from many different levels: institutional, theoretical, methodological, and of course personal, and that also varies from continent to continent. And the more I thought about how to approach these struggles that heterodoxy faces in a way that would be at least more pertinent for our discussion today, many ways to put this discussion together came to my mind, but then I decided to focus on 3 of them for today. Actually, I got very excited. My first draft of this talk had like 15,000 words, but there are lots of things to be said. Now, let me just change the slide. Okay, so what I ended up preparing for today, just 1 second, let me just have the time. Here we go. So yeah, what I have prepared for today in terms of trying to talk about that struggles is to focus basically on 3 issues. One of them is the issue of a label, why we need the term heterodoxy. And what I want to discuss here, which I think is pertinent for every heterodox economist, regardless of the continent, is to try to understand when and why heterodox economics become this consistent and identifiable object and necessary. And here I'm basically following Fred Lee's approach to that discussion. The second venue I thought would be quite interesting to discuss as well is the question of the orthodoxy focusing on the market, and how one of the challenges for most of the heterodox economists is to challenge that at the theoretical and methodological level. And the reason why I think that's important And here what comes to my mind is, for example, Matthias Vernengo chapter in that book is the discussion of is how sometimes orthodoxy get away from being blamed regarding support, the market, because if you mention the word neoliberalism, they're probably going to say, oh, I have nothing to do with that. And then I think this effort to trying to show the connection between orthodoxy, its focus on market, and neoliberalism is quite important. And many people have done that before. I'm not going to be the first one, but I'm trying again to tailor that for our discussion. And the last point is the knowledge production. And I think perhaps this is the most important point for us, in how economics has this Eurocentric aspect and what that means for us, Latin America. And I thought that the best way to do that is to focus on the question of economic development within economics, and then that could allow us to talk a little bit more about the Latin American tradition in heterodoxy. Okay, so let's start with the labor issue and what I mean by that. So if you start doing this, I'm not a historian, I don't know history of economics, but if you start reading about this and start digging about this, you can find the term heterodoxy back in the 19th century. And it's interesting because when you find the term, the first usage apparently is used to describe orthodoxy is economists that were following Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, in heterodox economies, that would be the infidels, are like the others, the more adventurous, who did, there's what Protein is saying in that book, it would be the economy, well, can't say like there was economists at the time, but it would be, economists that did not consent to the theories of the masters because they find them inadequate, even defective in more than one place. And if you go back to Europe in a way, more like similar to Europe, if you look, for example, in the 19th century, India, you can also find writings, and I hope I'm going to pronounce that right, from the Dadabi Narorij, Madan Mohan Malavya, and Govind Ranade, where there is also this idea of calling them heterodox at the time, or the saint voices, and that is in a book, right, by Amartya Sen. But, the question is, even if you start going back to the history of economic thought and trying to work, to understand, okay, so that goes back to Smith, there's Ricardo, what's happening here, or even Keynes in the 1930s, this is a very different approach than actually trying to question when heterodox economics became this consistent and identifiable object. That's a different investigation. If anything, if you go back to Smith or Marx in trying to think about heterodoxy in that time, we don't even have the social sciences broken off into so many different disciplines. So they even this very basic discussion to have. So what matters for that book for us right now, for our historical moment, what I see as a more modern mention of the term, it takes us back to the 1960s, or a little bit more than 1960s, but again, to go back to Fred Lee, you can start saying this term in the 1930s, actually. And what Fred Lee is saying is when you can identify, the term was used as an identifier of a person theory. All this dissented, they were dissented from the neoclassical economics. And that was used to refer to the institutionalist literature in the US in the 1930s and 40s, and Commons, Grunchi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So if you look into that history, that's when it really matters for us, that we have to try to understand what's happening. So, heterodoxy in that sense is not really just about a methodological, theoretical approach. There is this body of knowledge that was formed in a very specific context in this academic community. And as Lee is trying to make the case, if you don't look into the history of that community, you can't understand this category. You can't understand why and how heterodox economics and the theory behind it developed the way it is. So based on that kind of a discussion, this entire going back to the past, when heterodoxy started being used, changed a little bit. Because, if you think in terms of post-Keynesian economics, that doesn't come into being, let's say, with Keynes' publication of a general theory, but rather after the 1970s, when a community of self-identifiers post-Keynesians start calling themselves in US post-Keynesians. So these let's say this, I'm just checking my time. Oops. So this, does heterodox economics as this identified object did not really start with Smith, with Marx or Keynes, but rather in the last century, as I say, a little bit with the institutionalist economics. So there's a discussion why they didn't become more stronger. But then it is the 1960s and the 70s with the formation of this various different communities of economists who, later on would be identified as a heterodoxy. So you have a lot of organizations at this time being founded, the Union of Radical Political Economy in 1968, post-Keynesian economics in 1970s, which reminded me of Victoria Chick, who died 2 days ago, sadly. The Association for Institutional Thought in 1979. So all this is happening in Latin America. For us, is quite interesting because that's the moment where you're going to have the CEPAL, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, and then you start coming across names such as Raul Prebisch and Celso Furtado, and so on. In Africa, you have these radical economists who were brought together in the 1970s under the umbrella of the Council for Development of Social Science and Research, the CODESTRIA, was led by Samir Amin. So this is what's happening. And I think for us, just to finish that point, the question is why, right? Why these economists start feeling that they need to call themselves heterodoxy, and what that's different from the 90s, 30s, and 70s. And that has to do with the top departments in economics around the globe being increasingly more monolithic, right? More like one approach explains everything, and being very either unaware or hostile to alternative approaches. So for example, there's this book, The Select from 1953, Readings in Economic Theory, by the America Economic Association, where you're going to have Wicksteed, Friedman, but then also Sarafa, Robinson, Calder, which was amazing. It was diverse, was plural, but that's highly different than today if you look at the top 5 journal in economics. So, we have to understand, if you get by the 1990s, literally there's no mainstream scholars, they have to start finding places to go, right? Because they're not following that neoclassical theory. So it's important for us to understand, and one thing that's important here is that just in the 2000s that we really start using the heterodox economists to refer to all this in the sense of having the Australian Society for Heterodox Economists conference, then the first World Conference on the Future for Heterodoxy in 2003, and then in 2004, the Heterodox newsletter that was established. So, we have to understand that no one put their hands up, oh, I want to be a heterodox economist. Is that stronger in exclusionary division between what's the core and periphery, to use that term that most of us are very familiar, that actually start forcing these economists to find a house and to be able to identify themselves and organize things. So that's a quite important part I would like to discuss. I'd like not to discuss, but to everybody have in mind why this book is important. Is important because it's giving us a different take on issues we are very often taught in our normal degree or the standard degree. So we can go back to this a little bit more. And you know, it's interesting that nowadays, if you look at the, you know, departments around the globe that is teaching heterodox economics, you just find little hubs here and there. But you know, it's not, of course there are exceptions, but the traditional teaching of economics is more the mainstream approach. There is a problem of how defining mainstream and heterodoxy. You can come back to that when it's the question time. Now, spent too long on that, but it was important. My time almost there. So the orthodoxy and the market. What I want to say here really is that, you know, I think especially for the financial crisis and then pandemic, there's a consensus of how society or economists were not prepared to face crisis, right? And there are many discussions pointed out from a kind of intellectual deficiency that's like deeper and wider. It's how we think about unemployment, housing policy, labor market, the climate, and so on. And very often that discussion, there is this kind of dichotomy again between the market and its state. And that's why you see a lot of policy suggestions take us back to Keynes to restructure the economy for the common good and so on. And I agree with all this, but I think what's missing here is to really take us back to, you know, what's the relationship between economics and its market approach? And I think there are 2 points here I want to spend a little bit of time. Is the market, but it's also how we think about welfare, the state, social provisioning, and so on. Because social provisioning is something that's really at the core of most of the schools of thought that to be under the umbrella of heterodoxy. So, you know, the question, to me, this question is methodological, is theoretical, because it's not really just about to discuss neoliberalism, but it's about understanding the link between neoliberal policies and how economists emphasize this. You know, we have these theories that are pro-market theory. You know, if you think in terms of economics teaching and research, you take always the market equilibrium, the human rationality as the starting point. You have exception, you have behavioral economics, where, you know, there's tweaks here and there, but very often anyone teaching economic 101 or even, you know, other more like a macro, you're going to come across this kind of starting point. And then how the market is considered the most efficient allocating mechanism, how human interactions are thought to happen mainly through the market, and markets are theorized about being, you know, this mutual interaction of the supply, demand, and again, this equilibrium as a center concept. And I like to rescue here a female economist called Barbara Wootton, that in the 1930s, when she was criticizing Lionel Robbins, she said, you know, economists have this take about what the economy is, and then so is the equilibrium point, and then she called the stock pattern key to unlock the door to every theoretical problem is the equilibrium in the market. And then economists, they're dependent on that postulate. All the analysis start from that postulate, which for her is quite problematic. And that has to do with our profession trying to have this kind of objectivity regarding, I'm tracking my time again, regarding the real world, and comparing that actually for some regularities of the natural world. So, and this attempt to understand and be able to see the changes in the market as something that's predictable and show uniformity. But as you know, to go back to Barbara Wootton, so that is impossible. You know, she's arguing it's impossible to have a coherent theory or this kind of objective theory when you're talking about human behavior. And you know, if you're only able to do that as economists, they do, despite arguing that they're not normative. The only way you can do that is if you assume assumptions about human behavior, right? Which is when it comes the rationale, the question of this is a constant doing their best. The mention is they are doing their best to make the means go as far as possible in kind of this fulfillment of the said uses. All around the market, and then all these movements are in the market are the outcome of this behavior. So basically, the economists, they set themselves the task to modify theory to meet cases where people don't behave accordingly to that assumptions, right? But that is a problem, because the implication for that, and that's what you see in some of the chapters in this book, is that how the discipline deal with market and state is in a very, dichotomy way, in a dichotomical way, I think that's the word, and which take us to this market version of, if you can be more strict, is contractionism that take us to Buchanan and so on, where you justify this minimal state. But that's not new. Everybody knows about that. But I'm trying really to go back to show that how economics is behind this kind of approach. And that's not only the point. It's not just how we start seeing the state or intervention. It's also the question of not letting us to be creative. We teach our students to research in a way that's always the market. That's why when you face crisis as a pandemic, no one knows what to do, right? How we deal with that, how we think about society without going through markets and this kind of assumptions. So to me, to finalize that point, we need to make the orthodoxy accountable for providing us with a very narrow view of what the economic sphere is. That is the equal economic sphere to market, right? And that has a strong influence on public policy. And you need to challenge that, because if you don't challenge that, you're not going to be creative. We're not going to find a way to deal with all the pressing issues we are facing. And many heterodox economies also are much more in this kind of market lenses than before. So that's my point here. And that actually takes us to welfare. I want to highlight a little bit on welfare state. I'm almost there. Yeah, welfare state and social provisioning, because, again, if you start looking to this, if you track, if you start looking at the history of welfare state and social provisioning, you can see that all the changes we have, especially the question of the market failure, there's this intervention if there's market failure, is that, you see the evidence of how this market fundamentalism is behind the idea of weakening the state. You see that in the US, you see that in Europe, but also we see in Latin America in the 1990s. In that, this approach starts change how we deal with private sector in healthcare, education, housing. It's all about these market precepts and axioms, how they have, they influence how we understand public policy. And there are literature on that I liked very much, that is criticizing what actually was called the new public management, which was this paradigm in public policy that where you're trying to understand the government sector, under this market precepts and axioms, which actually is a consequence of, again, the neoclassical economic in the sense of it comes from the rational choice theory and so on. So this is quite interesting for us to look at. The new public management is not like, oh, this word neoliberalism, financialization, no one knows what's happening. No, actually, this was clearly studied, how we go to the public sector, how we change, how we operate, how we bring the market axioms in, and that was with this assumption that through the market you achieve this better allocation and so on. So, the discipline bias towards the market here is seen as pushing some of the services under the market umbrella because as efficient allocator of resources and so on. And what is said here is that when we do this, and when you try to justify intervention just if there's a market failure, we stop being creative in terms of thinking the role of the state. We have spent so much time talking about market failure and trying to understand that, but government, like us, the state is, how we get here, the state intervention is even worse than market failure. And then we just stop our students and our researchers to be creative about how to have a state that can work for everybody. And then again, we have crises such as a pandemic that gets us in trouble. Then we state intervene in a way that we don't see changes at the teaching and research level. Okay, so this is all I have to say here. Just to go to my final point. Oops. Oh, sorry, I had a different slide here. Sorry, that was the slide I should have here. I'm more confused now. Anyway, that's the last point that I want to make very quickly, which is the question of knowledge production. We need to think in academia as heterodox economists. And that takes me to the discussion of the Eurocentric aspects of I'm running out of time. The Eurocentric aspects of the discipline and how that links us to the colonization of economics. So we know that any social theory, you have so many implicit and explicit debates over methodology, different narratives, the issue of structure versus agency. So the history of social science is rather a history of this different views, interpretations, perspective, which makes very difficult to think in terms of a truth regarding the social reality. And we have to understand that we have different realities with different cultures, different way to express them, different methods to study them. And that's not subjective or ideological. It's not like, oh, you have to be neutral, universal. No, it's impossible because we have a different culture. And I'm not talking about cultural relativism. We can discuss that during the Q&A. So what happens if you think about that in economics, or if you think about that in terms of why that's important for us? Because when you think in terms of the process of social constitution of knowledge, that is the social history of making knowledge, this history is full of elements making, shaping, regulating knowledge. That idea that mainstream economists like to tell us, oh, that these economic theories is like this evolutionary stage. You have like the weak view of the history of economic ideas. This is a development before or backwards, and now we have that. This is highly problematic. We need to understand that, especially in academia, the forces behind a theory that starts being used more and more and more has very little to do with the merit of this theory and explain things. We have to start challenge that. And a specific point here for us, again, I mean, we could have just a presentation on this, is the question, specifically the question of the naturalization of capitalism and the origins of our discipline in developing economics, development economics, because the history of discipline, our discipline, coincide with the history of modernity and enlightenment, and the development of capitalism. And with that, we have to understand that's the moment when the West come into rule, and you have a lot of changes in the knowledge production, right? So you get disciplines such as history, philosophy, international relations. All the disciplines in the 60s, they start thinking, okay, let's be honest here. A lot of our thinking about how the world worked has been informed by worldviews that justified colonial rule in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Middle East. And especially in Latin America, you have Escobar that's also in others that discussing how trying to make this effort of decolonizing the social discipline. In economics has never really done that. Economics has never cared about that. But economics is one of the social disciplines that's more entangled with this moment, the advance of the modern capitalism would coincide with slavery, British Empire. It coincides with hierarchy in terms of race, with appropriation, expropriation, violence. So we have to bring that in that discussion, especially for continents such as Latin America, where if you think in terms of the history of capitalism, we have so many authors from Latin America making clear the question of uneven development, the question that not every single country can have this linear path toward becoming advanced capitalist country, which is like the Eurocentric approach has to do with that, like what happened in Europe. The question of this development in Europe has to be reproduced in every single country around the world, as if it's possible for every single country to have the same path that Europe or the global North had and achieve the gains they achieved. So that's the last challenge, how we think in heterodoxy in a way that we challenge capitalism, the history of capitalism. I'm talking about the history of capitalism. That's about knowledge production. And when we do that, how we consider scholarships that are not bind to this Eurocentric view of this kind of development of capitalism based on this idea that it happens in Europe endogenously, and then through the improvement of technology, hard work, rationality, all associated with enlightenment, and all the rest of the world, a bunch of savage or backwards. We have to start thinking about that, what that means for knowledge production, because that's a distorted history. The history of capitalism, a history of power struggle, exploitation, colonialism, how we bring that, because if you understand that, then you understand the question of development in a much deeper way, and you can understand the where Latin America is right now in a very different way as well. So yeah, so that's my last point. How one of the challenges as well for heterodox economics and academia is to go back and talk more about the historiography of capitalism, what that means for the knowledge production, and how then we can think about development in that context. And yeah, I have lots to say, but sorry, I'm very sorry, Gabrielle, for going very over my time. I stop sharing now. Wait, have I stopped sharing or? Yeah? Okay,
Yeah.
great. I'm very sorry for going too long.
No worries. Thank you so much, Carolina, for driving us in this reflection on the power dynamics and how is these implications for the Latin American region in our daily lives and the governance. Our next speaker is Gabriel Borsil, Officer of Economic Matters at CEPAL ECLAC. So Gabriel, let us know if you can share your screen.
¿Sí? ¿Funcionó?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfecto.
Perfect. It's working. Okay.
Desde el principio. Ahí. Perfecto, bueno.
Okay, perfect.
Tú, Karen, tú me avisas 5 minutos antes de terminar.
So you let me know
Te mando
when I have 5 minutes left.
Bárbaro.
Yes, please send me a message. Great.
La presentación la escribí en
Okay,
inglés, pero la voy a
so
hacer en
I wrote
español.
the
Me
presentation
pareció
in
que
English,
podía
but I
ser
will
un
be
poco
speaking in
ayudar a las
Spanish.
dos
That
comunidades
way, I will be
de lenguaje.
helping both communities, both language communities, I believe. First of all, I'd like to thank Ignacio and the publishers of this book.
Y decirles que disfruté mucho de la lectura
And
del libro.
I want to tell you
Creo que
that
es
I
un libro
enjoyed reading this book.
extremadamente necesario.
This is an
Y a lo
extremely
largo de
necessary
mi
book,
presentación espero
and
poder
throughout my
dar algunos
presentation, I
elementos que
hope to be
expliquen por
able to
qué
provide a few elements
pienso de
explaining
esa manera.
why I think this way.
Bueno, tal vez
Well,
presentar algunas reflexiones
I would
finales
like
sobre
to
cómo
provide some
seguir
final
y
reflections
seguramente en el intercambio después entre todos nosotros
on
algunos
this,
puntos pueden
and
ser
there might be
discutidos con mayor
a
profundidad.
few
Yo creo
questions
que el punto de partida
shared with the
tiene
community.
que
I
ser la
believe
idea de
that our
que
starting points
la
should
economía
be
está
the idea
pasando por una crisis,
that
la ciencia
economics
económica,
is in
¿no?
crisis.
Si uno se pregunta, ¿hay una
If we
crisis? Yo
ask
creo que
ourselves,
la
is there a
respuesta tiene que
crisis?
ser
I believe
por la positiva.
the
Hay
answer
efectivamente
is
un problema
yes.
muy
There
importante en
is
términos de
a
lo que
grave
nos ofrece
problem
la
in
teoría
terms
económica
of
dominante, lo que nos
what
ofrece
the
el paradigma
dominating
clásico.
economic
Y
theory
esto,
is
dicho por
offering us.
un economista heterodoxo, puede parecer
And
trivial, pero es algo que
this
se
could be
comparte
trivial to a heterodox economist, but it's shared by several neoclassical economists
muy importante en
with an important position
su propio campo.
and their own field.
Yo aquí seleccioné unos pocos ejemplos.
I have selected a few examples here. Agnes Deaton published in Le Monde on January 3rd the fact that economics, the way it is advancing, it is not offering the answers we're seeking for our world system. Nicholas Stern published in 2022 in the Economic Journal an article where he discusses the economic crisis as an instrument to discuss these problems. Let me share an anecdote with you. I was a student of Nicholas Stern. I won't tell you the year, because you will find me to be a caveman, but several years ago, I was a student of his, and he would say that the market had several imperfections, several flaws, very significant flaws. But nowadays, Nicholas Stern is one of the most important voices in the urgency for economics to avoid a disaster. Olivier Blanchard began a conversation with post-Keynesian economists such as James Galbraith and Mark Satterschmidt. There is some openness towards discussion, as a distributive problem. And this is a problem that was seen in the 60s, but seemed to disappear in the 70s. It's a long list of several points of view that are posing the need for an important change in economics. Everything that is being done in complexity in behavioral economics is one of the reasons why the expectations are changing, is because it used to be said that micro and macroeconomics couldn't be different, but they are very different. And behavioral theory, we are trusting patterns that do not match the way people are behaving in conventional macroeconomic models. This is indicative of a significant crisis and that there is space for change. I believe that this change will not be easy to achieve because the economy is not ready for it. And this is because there are power factors that explain their dominance in economic department. There is a book by Ashwani Said, the work of Cambridge Economics, the work of Zachary Carter, on how Keynesianism lost ground in the US. Starting from the 1950s, the Nobel factor, showing how the Nobel Prize was somehow used to give visibility to liberal theories. The book by Carlo Di Politi on evaluation criteria. And of course, this book, the book that you have created. This is like Zachary Carter for Latin American countries. You are telling the story of Zachary Carter and Mariana Barcuso. What they did for the global north, you are doing for Latin America, using elements of power and physical coercion, and how these elements changed economic schools, where there was an important focus on neoclassical economics. There's also institutional issues and the fact that heterodox economists moved to other schools, where because they weren't finding space in departments of economics. As Carolina said, it's not something possible to find in the past. For example, I remember that macroeconomics at MIT had Swan Robinson as one of the mandatory readings, but that disappeared. So there's this distancing. The good news is that heterodox economists are here to stay. This is a community that is growing, and it's offering answers. Maybe not in university departments, but an important point to make is something that you are arguing strongly, that democracy needs pluralism in economics. This very reductionist and narrow view that constitutes economics education is something that needs to be superseded by a broader view. The quality of the debate needs pluralism in terms of not just floating ideas, but a serious debate, a debate that acknowledges the legitimacy of what others have to say. To give you a few examples of how much has been lost in public debate due to the dominance of neoclassical economics. For example, equality and efficiency. How many generations grew up with the idea of the big trade-off between efficiency and equality? Nowadays, efficiency and equality can go hand in hand. And there are several reasons why this positive interaction exists. Financial liberalization, how much did it cost to Latin America? This discriminate opening in the 1970s. Financial liberalization does not seem to be exactly linked with growth. I remember you're very young, but in the 1970s, there was a paper by Alejandro called Goodbye Financial Repression. And it was the history of the the way we could recover from financial repression with low economic growth. The radical separation between short-term and long-term. There's an article by Philip Union saying anti-cyclical policies do not have long-term implications. Textbooks continue to mention that long-term and short-term are divided by an immovable wall, and therefore anti-cyclical policies have only short-term implications. The issue of, I will hurry up a little bit, but the issue of how people behave, the equilibrium, the Kantian equilibrium versus Nash equilibrium, the idea that Gintes used to say, a rational agent doesn't vote. Any individual who acts following the rules of optimization and rational expectations, they know that their vote doesn't count. An election is never decided by a vote, so voting or not voting is irrelevant. However, there are social rules, there are norms, regulation, and there are problems in behaviors, externalities, which are mainstreamed in the economy, showing the need to select the best equilibriums. That tends to be absent from education and economics. And that is a debate in public policy. To give you an example, The work we're doing at CEPAL, we have been trying to incorporate different perspectives, but overall different dimensions in the process of development to move out of the defined goal in terms of equilibrium and the idea of sustainability instead of equilibrium. Sustainability with several dimensions, an economic dimension, a social dimension, and an environmental dimension. I will not talk about the model in detail, the model proposed by CEPAL, but I'll give it provide it as an example of the possibility of incorporating, of taking this more ample view and to do it with simple diagrams, which can be taught at a classroom and which maybe not this model, but models that could be part of the debate, even at the plural level. We define the economic equilibrium as an external situation. We say that there's a social equilibrium when poverty is changing and when income redistribution is changing, and it involves eradication of poverty. It can be calculated broadly, and we can say that a growth path can be considered sustainable when it protects the environment for the needs of future generations. So a concept of sustainable development is related to overcoming external restrictions, center periphery, for example, which means financial power, currency hierarchy, very interesting heterodox literature on these issues. It also needs to be inclusive from the social point of view, and it needs to be environmentally sustainable. We use the equations, the conventional equations of growth models with external restrictions. We associate it to what you see in this graph, the growth central periphery. And the line, what's been drawn, what you see is the growth rate with a central periphery equilibrium. The way the periphery tends to elevate in this graph in a more sustainable way is by changing the elasticities of income, which involves industrial policy, technological policy, the transformation of patterns of the productive structure. We are wondering about these elasticities, we relate them to the technological characteristics of countries. What you see here on these graphs, these are graphs for different countries. On one side, we see the Schumpeterian efficiency and the Keynesian efficiency, which would have a higher demand dynamics. And what you see on the right is a positive relation between these two types of efficiency. So what we are posing here is the discussion of reducing asymmetries. And this is related to industrial and technological development. These are forbidden topics in classical economics.
desde el punto de vista
From
de
the point of view of
inclusión social, nosotros hacemos
social
ejercicios
inclusion,
mostrando la necesidad de una
we are
redistribución
showing
efectiva del ingreso, lo que significa
a
sacar una parte del
redistribution of
ingreso a
income,
los sectores
which means taking part of income
sectores
and
ingresos más
taking
altos
it
y distribuirlo en los sectores de
to
ingresos más bajos para sacarlos de la pobreza.
lower
Pero
income
además,
sectors in order to bring them out of
la idea es que el
poverty.
progreso técnico va
But the
generando
idea is
condiciones
for
de
technical progress
empleos,
to
mayor productividad,
generate conditions of
mayor capacidad de
employment
organización por parte
with
de los
higher
trabajadores, mayor
capacity
poder de
to
demanda, mayor
organize
formalización,
for
que implica
higher
que
demand,
también
higher
en esta
formalization,
transformación productiva
which
hay una mejora
implies
de
an
la participación de los
improvement
salarios en el
in
ingreso. Este es
the share
nosotros el
of
tipo de problema que
wages and
una
income.
mirada heterodoxa, una mirada centro-periferia, permite identificar que es, por
This
ejemplo, el gran
heterodox
problema
view
de la
enables us to
bajísima
view
productividad de la mayor
the
parte
problem
de
of low
los
productivity
trabajadores latinoamericanos.
Latin
En
American
en
workers,
particular, se señala la bajísima productividad de los trabajadores
particularly
informales.
the
En
low
el gráfico de la
productivity
izquierda se
in
ve
the
que
informal sector.
prácticamente 50% de los
At the left,
trabajadores,
you can see that
que
50%
más
of
del 50% de
workers,
los trabajadores en
over
2000 estaban
50%
en el
of
sector
workers in
informal
2000
y hoy día
were
está
informal,
casi
and nowadays it's
pero además,
almost
en el gráfico de la
50%.
derecha, la
On
bajísima
the right,
productividad de estos
you will see
trabajadores.
the
Y esto no
low,
es el
extremely
modelo
low
de
productivity of
esto
informal
no se
workers.
soluciona con el
And
modelo
this is not
de
solved with
Lewis, en el cual hay una acumulación
the moment where
persistente
there is
en el
persistent
sector
accumulation
moderno gracias a la
in the
concentración del
modern
ingreso,
sector
sino que
thanks
aquí
to the
saca a los
concentration
trabajadores de
of
la
income.
pobreza. Este progreso
But
técnico, ese cambio cultural, patrón de especialización.
this cultural change
Entonces, esto
is
se puede
what would
representar
change
de una manera muy sencilla, donde
this.
hay un
This can
aumento,
be represented very
hay una
simply.
reducción de la brecha tecnológica que lleva a
There's a
España
reduction of the
a tener
technological
mayor
gap,
tasa de crecimiento
which
comercial
leads
externo, en el
to
punto B,
higher growth
a
with
la derecha
external
ustedes ven el
equilibrium.
impacto que
On
eso
point
tiene
B,
sobre el
you will
empleo,
see
¿no? El empleo
the
formal, a
impact
medida que la
of
actividad
this on
satisfactoria crece,
employment,
¿no?
formal
Rápidamente se
employment
reduce la
as
informalidad,
the
¿no?
economy grows.
Aquí, el empleo
Informality
formal, esta curva muestra el
is
empleo
decreasing
formal cuando la economía pasa de A a B, gracias
when
al
the
cambio
economy
técnico,
goes
al
from
cambio
A to B
estructural,
thanks to structural change.
lo que se logra es llegar al pleno empleo
We can reach B,
en
which
el
is
que
full
esto
employment.
obviamente esto
This is an
se logra en la
example.
práctica,
Of
pero
course,
el
it's
objetivo es un pleno
very
empleo de las
difficult to
personas en el sector
achieve
formal.
in
Y
reality,
esto, a su
but
vez, tiene un
full
impacto
employment of people in the formal sector.
positivo sobre la
And
distribución del
this
ingreso en la
would
medida que
create a
estamos hablando de trabajadores del sector
positive
informal,
change
tienen
in the
mayor
distribution of
organización
income
sindical y mayor poder de negocio.
with a higher
Finalmente, le
power of
agregamos a todo esto
negotiation.
una tercera curva, que es la curva
There's
que
a
nosotros
third curve,
llamamos la frontera de
which
eficiencia
is what we call the
eficiencia
center
ambiental
periphery environmental
centro-periferia,
frontier,
es cuánto puede crecer la
which is how
periferia dado el
much
crecimiento
the
del
periphery can
centro
grow
para
due to the
alcanzar
growth of the center
los
in order to reach
niveles de emisión que la
two
periferia
levels
prometió
of emissions
alcanzar
that the
a
periphery
través de las contribuciones
promised
nacionalmente determinadas
through
en París. O sea,
nationally
ver,
determined
si
contributions.
el centro crece a esta velocidad y
So
no
if
dice
the
tanto,
center
¿cuánto
grows
podemos
at
crecer
this
nosotros
speed,
dada la
how
tasa de
much
progreso
can we
técnico?
grow?
El progreso técnico que desacopla
Uh,
emisiones de crecimiento,
Given
dado ese
technical
progreso
progress,
técnico, ¿cuánto podríamos
given
crecer
this
para cumplir con las
technical
promesas que
progress,
la
how much
propia
can we
América Latina hizo
grow
en
in order
crecer
to
por
fulfill
debajo del
our
50%
promises
del
as Latin
PIB? Esto nos
America?
da como una frontera de cuánto podremos crecer.
And this gives us a frontier, how much we can grow.
Aquí cruzamos las tres curvas, cruzamos una
Here
curva
we
que es
cross-reference
la
the
del
three
equilibrio
curves,
externo, que es la EE,
the external
la frontera de
equilibrium, EE,
eficiencia ambiental centro-periferia, que es
the
CPF,
environmental
y
efficiency,
la línea
CPEF,
azul es cuánto
and the blue
necesitamos
line
crecer
is
para
how much we
erradicar la
need to
pobreza en un
grow
cierto
in
periodo
order
de
to
tiempo
eradicate poverty in
definido hasta
a
el
certain
2030.
timeline, which we have
Distribución del
set for
ingreso,
2030.
cambio
Redistribution of
estructural hacia un
income,
empleo de calidad,
structural
empleo
change,
formal, organización
formal
sindical,
employment,
redistribución, políticas
unions,
sociales. Esto
redistribution,
tiene que
social
llevarnos en
policy.
el 2030
This
a cero
needs
pobreza.
to lead us
Pero para llegar a
to
eso,
poverty
precisamente se
zero.
eligió esta etapa que
But
es
we
la
need
línea
to
azul. Si esta
grow
tasa
up
es
to
mayor que la que nos permite
the
crecer
blue line.
la
And the blue
restricción
line
externa.
is
Pero
higher
además,
than
la
what
tasa
we
que nos
are able
permite
to grow
la que nos
with
permite
external
crecer la restricción
restriction.
externa, que es la E, es mayor que la que podríamos crecer
But
si
this is
queremos
also higher
respetar los
than what
límites
we can
de
grow if
emisiones
we
de
want
CO2
to limit our CO2 emissions, which we as Latin Americans promise to respect. So how much can we grow with external equilibrium, with the restrictions, and with our commitments to environmental sustainability? The results of this, in principle, just with external restriction, this is a restriction that due to debt, due to external crisis, this is where we're finding the brakes that are stopping our growth. But the market is not going to solve this. Thus, the market is not going to solve the environment. So industrial and technological policies tackling these problems at the same time are fundamental. We drew this triangle where we mentioned that in order to have social equilibrium, we need redistribution policies. Growth is not enough. We need very strong policies of redistribution. That's why it is represented here as a blue line, social protection. That is social protection. That is redistribution in society where people are concentrating an embarrassing amount of wealth. But we need at the base of it technical change, the reduction of asymmetries, promoting international competitiveness. This enables us to move external equilibrium towards what we need to achieve social equilibrium. And at the same time, this technical change needs to be linked to decoupling. Technical progress needs to move towards environmentally friendly progress. And this needs a lot of industry policy, a lot of technical progress. And that is a discussion that we are not able to reach with the dominant economics. Unfortunately, that is what current students are learning, and these discussions do not emerge in current academia. And with small corrections, we would be able to use these changes in order to make social change. This is where I'll end. I believe that the strength of orthodoxy shows several cracks, but this is a moment when more opportunities are appearing for a conversation. I'm in favor of tending bridges. Building bridges are not just for enemies to cross, but it's also for us to cross over. And those who have refused to sit down and dialogue have been the orthodox. And I don't know, it might have something to do with power, but these debates are opening up. I believe that insisting with the education of young economists is key to improve the quality of the debate. This book is great at showing the deterioration of public policy and democratic debate, as shown in Chile with the story that you tell that has been related to this. Continuing with the institutionalization of this group of more heterodox economists, I believe that networks are being built, and I'm under the impression that there is a stronger institutional presence. We were at the post-Keynesian Congress in Berlin. This is a wonderful experience. Very high quality work was seen there. And aside from institutionalization of our point of view, I believe that there is a glimmer of hope that the worldview will change in teaching economics, because the boundaries, the frontiers of heterodox thinking are blurring based on the emergence of views, of visions that are challenging these fields and are not communicated with the core, but I believe that they are debilitating this rigid point of view. There are books, textbooks, there are excellent textbooks that may help us in this process of construction of a more plural teaching, and we would need to see how to incorporate them into our curricula. I'll stop here. Once again, thank you so much for the invitation and congratulations for this excellent book. And it is a very important contribution.
Gracias, Gabriel. Carolina,
Thank you, Gabriel,
como
Carolina.
tuviéramos
Once
el tiempo,
again,
los escuchamos 100 años.
we would listen to you for 100 years if we could.
Escucharlos.
It's always a pleasure to
Ahora,
listen to
parece,
you.
tomamos un par de preguntas.
Now, let's take a few questions
Si
from the
alguien
audience.
quiere hacerlo directamente, levante la mano.
If
o
you want
pónganla
to
en la
ask a
sección de
question
preguntas
directly,
y respuestas.
raise your hand, or you can write your question on the Q&A
Aprovechen
section.
antes de cerrar.
Just take this time before we close this session.
Y a la barra uruguaya que pase alguna vez por Cepale para conversar.
And the guys from Uruguay, come by to Cepal.
hay una mano levantada.
Let's chat.
Carlos, Javier,
There is
Isaí Remejía.
one
Si le pueden dar
hand, one raised hand.
acceso a que encienda su micrófono, por favor.
Could we let him open his mic?
Ahí estás, Carlos. ¿Lo puedes
Carlos.
activar?
Sí, ¿me escuchan?
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfecto.
Yes,
A ver,
perfectly.
primero, gracias por la oportunidad. y
First of
realmente
all,
es un
thank you for
gusto
this
compartir con
opportunity.
colegas de tan alto
It's a
nivel.
pleasure to
No
share
puedo hablar en los
with
dos idiomas al mismo
such
tiempo, así que al igual que el
quality
colega anterior voy a hablar
colleagues.
en español.
I will be speaking in Spanish.
Realmente me encantó el
loved
análisis de Previs que
the
hizo la colega primeramente,
analysis made by the first colleague
las conclusiones finales
and the
del
final
colega Gabriel, es su
conclusions
nombre, ¿verdad?
of Mr.
Que
Gabriel,
pues orientan todo
I believe is
hacia
his
la
name,
cuestión de
geared
la
towards
combinación de varias
the
áreas para la
combination
generación,
of
en este
several
caso de las políticas
areas for
públicas,
the
donde se generan las
design of
relaciones
public
internacionales,
policy,
incorporan todas las diferentes
generating
áreas en un
international relations,
approach, en
and
una
joining all the different areas in an
bastante objetivo que
approach
permita
that is
contribuir
very
al
objective
desarrollo
and that
realmente, que
may
es el fin de todos nosotros y de
enable
toda la ciencia realmente,
sustainable
donde un
development,
punto muy
which is our
importante es
goal.
tomar en cuenta las
We also need
diferencias,
to take into account
la
the
falta de homogeneidad,
differences, the
tanto a nivel
lack
interno del
of
país como
homogeneity,
hacia afuera. Una de
both
las
in our countries
razones,
and
por ejemplo, por la
outside.
cual en Europa
Some of the
muchos países
reasons
de la Unión Europea
why
no pudieron incorporarse adecuadamente
several
es porque había
European
diferencias
countries
sustanciales
couldn't join the
entre
EU
ellos y, como
was
bien indicaba el
their
colega, es necesario
differences,
subir,
and it is
tomar en cuenta la
important
restricción de
to
cuánto
take into
debemos
account the
crecer,
restriction of how much we
cuánto
need to
es
grow,
la restricción externa
how
y cuánto
much
son las
is our
posibilidades
external
realmente en el
restriction, and
marco
what
del
are the
contexto actual
possibilities
de
in
cada
our
país
current
y
context.
cómo cambiar esos
in order to change, to elicit change in each country, and to elicit change with technological progress in order to diversify, to produce what people need to export, and take into account the fact that there is great potential in Latin America. There's a lot of opportunity. For example, the colleague was talking about the issue of incorporating environmental issues, which is vital. And there are several initiatives. I'm sorry, Carlos. Do you have something more concrete? We have 2 more questions. There are several initiatives like tax reforms in developed countries that are able to cover the needs to invest just in that area, but there are others, for example, the forgiveness of debt for swap funds and carbon sequestration, which is also contributing to the implementation of public policy, enabling sustainable and inclusive development of population, because it's not just sustainability, but the inclusion of all sectors of our population for a true sustainable and inclusive development. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry for taking so much time. Thank you. There is a provocative question. Let me read it to you. Felipe Diaz Infante asks, in the broad context of heterodox economics, what is the position of Marxist and or radical economists? So Marxists will say whether they consider themselves heterodox or not. So what would be the contribution of heterodox economists in teaching economics? Another question, what is the role of this crisis in the development of this economic thought in Latin America, both in governments and in academia? Thank you so much, says Guillermo Matamoros. And he says, hello from Ottawa. These would be the questions before we close this session.
Gabriel, would like to go first because I was first before. So, Karen, you decided.
¿Quién lo tome? Vas.
Okay, so I go.
Yes.
Just one quick comment. I think the first question was more for Gabriel, but I just want to mention a different kind of how we strain our institutions regarding the implementation of policies and how we think about that. And I think we have to carry on building and strengthening these institutions, but I also think we have to trying to do that from the local perspective. I think a lot of the problems we see in these international organizations the last century, apart from exceptions, is always trying to copy or mimicking what was working in developed economies, which has to do with my last aspect regarding colonizing economics. So I think we have to also start having that in mind as well. And the other point in that question is the question of dialogue. I think, and Gabriel mentioned that I think economics is one of the few disciplines where that, that space of exchange and different views is not happening in a way it should be happening, because that's how you, you evolve and develop new ideas. The battle of ideas should be something normal in a discipline like economics. And I think the reason why that's not happening, one of the reasons is because we trying to removed from economics all the question of ideology and politics, thinking that we can have a science that's objective and neutral and so on. And then we don't discuss some of the aspects of the discipline that are politically motivated or ideological motivated, and they will be, but this discussion should be on the table so we can deal with that better and carry on this exchange. Regarding the Marxist question, Marxist, I would very much place them Marxist, the school, Marxist school, under the umbrella of heterodox economics. And I think for developed economics, that's even more important, because if you think about I didn't have much time to develop that well, but when you're thinking about Latin America and different theories that were challenging not only the modernization theory, but also the developmentalist, Richman and others at the time, this criticism is coming from dependency theory, which has very strong Marxist background, and this influence coming from Latin America scholarship. So I think this is quite important. And I think when you start thinking about a different kind of economics at academic level, so just to make that clear, when you're criticizing economics for not talking about different inequalities, not just wealth inequalities, but gender inequality, racial inequality, it's quite surprising that you see many Marxists discussing these topics, right? Many radical economists discussing that since the 60s. So, sometimes you keep thinking, the economists, they are like, you need to start talking about racial inequality. You should start talking about, inequality. And you have a broad literature, more radical discussing that. And that takes back to the first question. If we are engaging more with each other, perhaps we could learn from each other. But yeah, of course, that's again the question of ideology and politics. A lot of the Marxian economics is just dismissed. And that's another challenge in a way for heterodoxy, not just in Latin America, but around the globe. Very quickly on praxis, public policy, I'm not as familiar as I should with Latin America, or even the case of Brazil, but in the UK, the departments of economics and organizations who have access to the government, very often they are in top departments in economics, and very often the education and the device is very much within the mainstream world. That has changed a bit since the crisis, because some aspects of the government became more open for the pandemic as well. We have economists such as Mariana Mazzucato that managed to have that engagement with policymakers. But what I see here is, very, the common is more the mainstream economists having access to the government. And I think this is a challenge for heterodoxy. And this challenge you can't face this challenge without challenge the knowledge production, how we see the hierarchy of journals who receive funding, because the question for heterodox economists is that they don't get the platform because they have to face all these institutional obstacles to be considered worth it, or to have merit to be then the government look into whatever department they are and go, okay, they are doing good work, So I think we have to try to think about that as well. And I'm going to leave the last question for Gabriel, just because I took a lot of time, but yeah.
Okay, gracias por las preguntas.
Thank you for the questions. Sorry to Karen, I hadn't seen your message about the 5 minutes. I was about to write 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds. I was 2 minutes over, maybe 5. I'm sorry about that, but I have a friend here. He wants to be near when I have these online presentations. Regarding how to move forward, I believe that the Brazilian case is interesting because, that is where heterodox economists have a heavier presence, as you know. The Federal Minas Gerais, Federal de Rio de Janeiro are very important schools with heterodox economists, and this is strongly related to the way, the hierarchy of journals in Brazil. And this enables heterodox economists to opt for economic schools because they know that they will be taken more seriously. So I believe that there's an important battle regarding getting evaluation criteria to respect different points of view and to provide some space to different schools of thought. Anyway, that would be a way to boost more options for our colleagues in heterodox economics. About our Marxist colleagues, there's a quote by Paul Samuelson. He was asked if there was anything important that Marxists had discovered and that neoclassical economists had already incorporated. And he said, yes, the struggle of classes. Apparently, the neoclassical elements are incorporated in the struggle of classes. But it's important to incorporate the point of view of historians and Marxists and our heterodox view. This would help us understand the power dynamics behind the economic parameters. For instance, I'll give you a very current example. We have a discussion between post-Keynesians about growth models, and this discussion has led me to look at institutions closely and to wonder why a certain growth path, which is debt-led or export-led or demand-led, that discussion, which is very traditional between post-Keynesian economists, is incorporating political scientists and the social blocks. And there are works that say that you need to combine several points of view in order to understand growth paths. Gramscian, that you need to combine the Gramscian view of social blocks. There's a space for dialogue there in order to understand spaces where there's a lot of Marxist tradition. I couldn't write down the last question. Could you repeat it? There was one about the crisis of current economic thinking from the point of view of academia and public policy. And what's the role of teaching there? Of course, I believe to talk about Carlo Di Politi's book about the importance of a pluralist view in teaching economics in order to improve the quality of economic debate. There's something interesting here, and it's a bit paradoxical. When you hear a policymaker, even the most heterodox one, and if you ask them what's happening the next year, they never say there might be a technological clash that veers the economy from its natural path. They're like, well, let's see what happens with consumption, with exports. From the point of view of practical analysis, the dominance of Keynesianism is absolute. We haven't been able to win this battle in academia. No one says that they use real business either. The real issue here are central banks
modelos que supuestamente tienen
models
una base
that
ortodoxa, pero que en realidad es
supposedly
demasiado
have
ortodoxa.
orthodox bases, but they're absolutely ad hoc. It's very complex, actually.
Y la otra gran batalla, yo creo que
And
la gran
the
batalla
other
del debate
battle
público que surge
in public
es
debate,
no tanto en la discusión con los
which is
policymakers, sino con el
coming
público,
not just
sino
with
la
policymakers, but rather with the
legitimidad de las
audience
políticas
at large.
keynesianas, de las políticas
It's about
distributivas, que
legitimacy
eso tiene que
of
mucho que ver
Keynesian
sí con la
policy.
enseñanza de la
And
economía,
this is
con ese
related to
sentido
teaching
común que
economics, and
permea
with
el
it's
debate
related to
en
this
los
common
diarios,
sense
en las
enabling
apariciones,
debate
ese sentido común
and
de
newspapers, etc.
capitalismo, de la
This
propiedad,
common
de
sense
la
in
gobierno, etc.
government welfare, austerity, etc.
Debemos mucho justamente a Mariana, que ha
We owe a
logrado
great deal to
sacudir
Mariana,
como pocos
who has
eh,
shaken
digamos, ese saber
this
convencional
knowledge,
tan
this conventional
incorporado
knowledge that is
al
deeply
debate en los
entrenched
medios
in the debate
de
on the
prensa,
media.
lo ha sacudido y ha puesto como una
She has
mirada
shaken
diferente.
it, and she has provided a
Yo
different
creo que es
point
un
of view.
éxito
I believe that
francamente impresionante, porque
that's something
por
really
mucho
impressive,
tiempo ha sido prácticamente imposible que
because
la prensa
it was
muchas veces los
impossible
policymakers abrieran sus puertas
to
a una
get the
discusión
media outlets and policymakers to
franca sobre
open
política como
themselves to
ahora.
honest
Mariana hizo lo que logró,
discussion
que
the way
inclusive en el caso
Mariana
de
has
la
done.
Yo paro por ahí. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias, Gabriel. Ahora sí,
Thank you, Gabriel.
gracias a todos. Los
Thank
que
you,
se quedaron,
everyone.
los que nos acompañaron al inicio, los que
Thank
se
you
quedaron hasta
to
el final.
those
Gracias a Carolina,
who stayed
a
here
Gabriel,
till the
Lau.
end.
Ojalá nos
Thank you,
vemos
Carolina. Thank
pronto
you, Gabriel.
por Zoom
I hope
presencial,
to
si nos
see
vamos a
you
Uruguay,
again,
un
once
deseo.
again. If we go to Uruguay, we'll see you
Que
there.
sigamos en contacto,
Or let's
que
meet online.
ojalá que
Let's
esta
keep in
charla,
touch. And I
que
hope
este libro
that this talk and this
inspire a
book
muchos estudiantes de
has
economía a
inspired
continuar en este
inspired
camino, a aportar
economics
y a continuar
students to
reflexionando.
follow this path
Felicidades a los
of
editores de
reflection.
America Soy. Gracias a
Congratulations to
Teaching
America Soy
Economics.
and the
Estamos muy
editors.
contentos.
We're really happy.
Acompáñenos ya en sus casas con una copa de vino, lo que tengan para celebrar.
Join
Nos vemos
us
pronto. Gracias.
with a glass of wine at your homes. Thank you so
Muchísimas
much.
Gracias. Parabéns, obrigada.
Abrazos.
Felicitaciones.
Muchas
Chao,
gracias.
chao.
Congratulations. Bye.
Chao, Gabriel.
Gracias. Chao.